are more than the sum total of our wounds. The priest's voice echoes through the nearly empty cathedral nave. From where I kneel, I look up to Tiffany windows, angels with lilac wings and golden hair gesturing toward a city of light. I remember the martyr's mirror, ancestors who entered flames singing, who refused to sit in a temple of images.
Mennonites are first and foremost Christians who have a particular understanding of the gospel that calls them to, as much as possible, live out the words of Jesus. And they know they can't do that alone, so it means that they have a high view of the church as a community.
We are pacifist, so we don't believe in going to war at all, or any kind of violent action. We tend to live more simply in some ways. I think that's also something that a lot of Mennonites today are struggling with is they are a lot more incorporated into the mainstream culture, but just the idea that there's a lot of ways that we can simplify our lives. So our worship services are all very simple. There's not a lot of worship music. We tend to stick to hymns.
It's just been such a tradition for so long that in our churches we sing in 4 parts, and it's many times a cappella. So there's a certain level of musicianship that has just been part of the Mennonite church for a long time.
The Mennonite church doesn't believe in baptizing as a baby. They believe in baptizing when the individual is ready to make that commitment, and so it's a personal choice and you can do it whenever.
In the 16th century, the idea that you could be baptized as an adult rather than as an infant was deeply troubling to the authorities of 16th century society. It meant that you had a view of the church as separate from the state, and that was problematic. It made you a traitor. It made you a heretic. The Anabaptists were actually a persecuted group, a persecuted minority, and between 3,000 and 4,000 Anabaptists were arrested, tried, and executed, often in public and often gruesome executions on account of their faith, and many thousands more were tortured, were banished, had their property taken away. Some groups found it important to tell the story of the suffering that was entailed in their religious convictions, and so they began to gather stories of persecution and endurance. A man named Thielman van Bracht pulled all of those stories together into a massive tome which has become known as the Martyr's Mirror. It's a very thick book. The first half of the book tells the story of Christian suffering from the time of Jesus, Jesus being the archetypal martyr, up until the 16th century, so that the Anabaptists of the 16th century understood their suffering to be in continuity with a long tradition of Christian martyrdom. And then the second half of the book are stories that come out of the Anabaptist experience.
When you died, I thought someone should go to the piano and apologize. You were right all these years when you said that the fingernails had to be clipped to the skin in order to make the best sound, that the spine should be aligned like trumpet keys, the heels hugging the floor unless you were carrying the sound on the back of the pedal. You touched the piano like you'd memorized her contours. You could bend each key into any shape and lather notes until they spit perfect bubbles into the laps of silence. But no one told the piano when you stopped coming to her, or that you died while your husband held himself in a dark chair, stroking the hand that made people listen, reminding your fingers that each one still carried within its very bones an unplayed song. When I write, I don't necessarily think of myself as a Mennonite writer who's writing about subjects that fit with the Mennonite church, because I tend to not necessarily write about my faith or those kinds of things, but in subtle ways that aren't necessarily spelled out. Being Mennonite has informed the way I write.
I'm bivocational, so I'm a quarter-time pastor here at College Mennonite, and then I'm also a theater director and instructor at Bethany. Theater constantly reminds me to have empathy, and that's a skill that we have to practice constantly in pastoral ministry. And then in my work directing and teaching, I'm a pastor a good portion of my time. For me, that is a way of taking it outside of the church walls, because I would go nuts if this was my entire world. And I think we should go nuts if this is our entire world. People get a little confused because they think that the Mennonites came from the Amish, whereas it's opposite. First came the Mennonites, and then the Amish split off of the Mennonites when they thought Mennonites were getting too worldly.
The Amish would have perhaps a stronger understanding of the church as a separated community.
Mennonites are much more out into the world. Also, the Amish have much stricter rules. Mennonites can dance, Amish can't. We dress differently, just, yeah, a lot of differences.
Boxing Andy, made in China.
Oh, wow.
I think a lot of Mennonites, and especially at Goshen College, we have one of our core values is being a global citizen and being citizens of the world instead of just staying in a little bubble. I think is also something that helps you to think about issues more broadly and being more open to change and to fixing problems.
The most rapid growth of the Anabaptist Church in the last 50 years has been in countries outside of Europe and North America. In many of those places, the Anabaptist family continues to experience suffering and poverty. And so it seems to me that it would be important in the spirit of the Martyr's Mirror to gather in a systematic way stories of the suffering church with a view towards compiling these stories in a new Martyr's Mirror for the 21st century, that might work towards a deeper sense of unity in the midst of our divisions, and also an awareness that the comfort and ease and prosperity that we have now is not shared by other brothers and sisters.
I think it's helpful for all of us to have kind of a mantra for our lives, which changes as we go through life. But my current one seems to be the Matthew passage of Jesus saying the greatest commandment is to love God with all our hearts and souls and mind and strength, and that the second one is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And then on these two things hinge all the law and the prophets. So in decision making, everything hinges on the ideas of loving God and loving neighbor.
With this line that said, well, did you remember to grab the leash shot? Me too. It's like a dog, right?
The future of a tradition in a modern setting is a challenging question. There are an awful lot of forces that conspire against the maintenance of a coherent tradition. I mean, mass media, the homogenization of our culture, the impact of consumer capitalism, the ongoing claims of the nation state on our allegiance. I think all of those make it more difficult to preserve the particularity of an identity.
What's really important about the Mennonite culture, I think those things will hopefully stay the same. And so, this idea that hundreds of years later, people in their 20s are still holding huge hymn sings, once a month. I just think that's kind of, in a lot of ways, really weird and really cool.
We've lived in a very individualistic society and a very materialistic society. Mennonites have countered that for a really long time, and I think we've always been a little bit apologetic about it. But I think we are now in a culture that is starting to crave that. the way that we've been living as a culture, we're learning that it's actually not sustainable. Mennonites have a role to play in showing a different way. Now, we can only do that if we actually live by that different way, which is part of our struggle. We're not Amish, so we don't close ourselves off from the rest of the world. So finding a way to instead of just embracing the culture around us, help to change the culture around us. That's a bit of a prophetic voice.
Shouts out directions, models kick turns. Teens in jeans circle and swing, lock arms and spin with matrons and grandparents, release and exchange places. No one stays an insider or an outsider for long. Suddenly the caller is calling out to me. I rise above my heavy, stumbling clogs, airy as my skirt of Indian gauze, and find myself at home, dancing among Mennonites.